Hello, everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of upstate New York, the kind of roads that felt like they existed just to disappear into the woods. It was late December, and the sky had already turned a heavy gray, the kind that makes everything feel smaller, colder, and more isolated. The temperature had dropped steadily as I went further from the main highways, and the storm that had been threatening all day finally decided to arrive. The first flakes fell softly, almost beautiful, but within minutes they had thickened, turning into a thick, white curtain that made the headlights of my car barely reach the next curve. My tires squeaked on the slick pavement, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter than I had all day. I realized I had been driving blind in more ways than one. I needed a reference, something solid, so I pulled over at the next place I saw, a small gas station with a single pump, dim lights flickering from above. The windows were fogged from the cold, and inside, it smelled faintly of motor oil and stale coffee. I sat in the car for a minute, trying to calm myself, watching the snow blow across the empty lot, piling into drifts against the edges of the building. Eventually, I stepped inside, needing the warmth, needing to see the map clearly. It was nearly empty. Shelves of snacks, a counter with a register, a few cigarette displays. And then I saw him. He appeared from the corner of the store, his coat ragged, hair wet and plastered to his head from the snow outside. He moved with a hesitant shuffle, like he was weighing every step, and when he stopped near me, I noticed how thin and tired he looked. There was a smell sharp and bitter, of alcohol and cold sweat. He asked if he could get a ride a few miles down the road. Normally, I would have said no without a second thought. My first instinct, rational and protective, screamed at me not to. But the storm was worsening outside, and I caught a flicker of panic in him, the kind of desperation you only see when someone has nowhere else to go. Against my better judgment, I agreed. As we left the gas station, the wind had grown louder, whipping the snow against the windshield, streaking it into patterns that made it hard to see even with the wipers on full blast. Immediately, his presence in the car was suffocating. He smelled stronger, like a mixture of alcohol and something metallic, like rust or old blood. He kept leaning forward slightly, just enough to make me feel cornered in my own space, his eyes darting to my hands on the wheel, then back to the road. I told myself it was just the cold, that it made people fidget and look nervous, but there was something else too. Something in the way he was staring, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he lingered just a little too long near my side. I tried to focus on the road, to ignore the feeling of eyes tracing every motion I made. He began asking questions, slowly at first, about where I lived, if I would be alone, what the area was like. I laughed nervously at the absurdity of it, trying to sound casual, but inside my chest was tight, my pulse racing. Every question was layered with a kind of underlying hunger, a way of understanding what kind of person I was, what I had, and what I could protect. The snow outside became heavier, falling thick and fast, creating a white fog that made the trees on the side of the road mere shadows. The road narrowed, ice slicked and unpredictable. My tires slid slightly once, then again. My heart jumped with each squeal of the rubber against the pavement. Then it happened. He leaned over to help, reaching toward the map spread across my lap to point out a turn. His hand brushed mine, and I jerked sharply, nearly losing control. I could feel the car slide on the ice as I gripped the wheel tighter, adrenaline burning through my veins. Something inside me screamed that I couldn't trust him, that the snowstorm, the isolation, and the darkness made me completely vulnerable. I didn't need words to know that if something went wrong, I had no backup, no one for miles who could help. My eyes searched desperately for any kind of turn-off, a place to stop safely. When I saw a small cleared area beside the road, I made a snap decision. I pulled over, telling him I needed to check the map again. I opened the door and stepped out into the storm immediately. The snow was up to my knees, cold cutting through my boots and coat. I ran. The wind whipped at my face, snow hitting my skin like tiny needles. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but the sound was drowned by the roar of the storm. I didn't look back. Every step was exhausting, the snow heavy, my lungs burning. I ran blindly at first, then tried to aim toward anything that resembled light, shelter, a sign of life. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a faint glow through the white haze. A farmhouse, windows lit from within, warm and steady against the chaos outside. I ran faster, slipping and falling once, scraping my hands on the ice and snow, but I kept going until I reached the door. I banged on it, cold seeping into my bones, trembling uncontrollably. A couple inside opened it immediately, startled but concerned, and I practically fell into their arms, breathless and shaking. They let me in, offering blankets, hot tea, and the calm that I hadn't realized I craved until I was inside. I explained as much as I could, pointing out the direction I had come from, the man in the car. They listened carefully, and one of them called the police while the other stayed with me, making sure I didn't collapse from exhaustion and fear. I sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a mug of steaming tea, shivering even as the warmth touched my skin. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe. When the police arrived, the man was gone. Tracks in the snow showed he had vanished into the blizzard, leaving nothing but a trail that ended abruptly, swallowed by the white chaos. I gave them as many details as I could, trying to make sense of everything, to understand the terror that had gripped me. Later, when I finally started driving again, it was daylight, and the roads were dangerous but visible. I drove slowly, every shadow and bend in the road making me flinch, every figure in the distance raising my heart rate, until I could see familiar signs, familiar markers, the way roads curved into towns I recognized. It took days to stop replaying the image of him in my mind. The way he had grinned when I bolted. The way he had leaned over just enough to make me feel trapped. And the complete lack of empathy in those dark eyes. But I survived. I made it home, locked doors, checked every window. The terror stayed with me in the corners of my mind. The feeling that the world could shift from ordinary to dangerous in a single instant. But I also remembered the farmhouse, the couple who helped without hesitation, the warmth that replaced panic. That clarity, that sharp contrast between fear and safety, reminded me that even in the worst, most isolated moments, there could be a refuge. It was a winter I would never forget. The memory of him disappearing into the storm lingered, a reminder of how quickly isolation and bad luck could turn deadly. But the warmth I found at that farmhouse, the kindness of strangers when I had nothing, stayed with me longer, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest, coldest night, there could be light. And that night I understood fear like I never had before, but I also understood survival. I understood the importance of instinct, of moving fast, of trusting my gut. And I knew that no matter what happened in the future, I would remember exactly how to act, exactly how to escape, because I had lived through it, raw and real, and made it out alive. The snow melted eventually, roads cleared, life went on. But every winter after that, when the sky turned gray and storms came fast, I remembered that night, the desperation and the fragile line between safety and danger. And I was never careless again. The morning I went ice fishing, the sky was a pale, washed out gray, and the wind was relentless. My friend had suggested we meet at a lake far out in rural Minnesota, a place neither of us had fished before. When I arrived, the road leading to the lake was covered in packed snow, the kind that crunches under tires and leaves a thin film of ice beneath. The car shuddered as I drove slowly, the tires slipping occasionally on hidden slick spots. The only sounds were the whistling wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a frozen branch. The lake itself opened up suddenly as the trees parted, stretching wide and flat, its surface frozen solid. Patches of snow dotted the ice unevenly, hiding pockets where the ice looked darker, thinner. Only a few other fishermen were scattered across the lake, small dots of color hunched over holes they had drilled hours before. The rest of the ice seemed untouched, raw, and silent. I parked near a small snowbank that marked the edge of the lake, the engine of my car still ticking as it cooled, and began unloading my gear. My breath came out in short, white puffs, the cold already seeping through my layers, despite the thermal shirts, hooded sweatshirt, and heavy winter coat I wore. My gloves were thick, but the cold stung through them as I shifted my fishing box and auger from the car. I decided to go farther out, away from the small cluster of other fishermen. There was a quiet appeal to the distance, the solitude, the untouched stretch of ice that seemed infinite. Each step I took crunched over snow and scraped against ice, the sound almost deafening in the emptiness. I could see my own tracks behind me, shallow impressions leading out to where I would set up. The wind whipped across the lake, cutting at my face, making my eyes water despite my scarf wrapped tightly around my neck and lower face. Once I found a spot that seemed solid and flat, I set my bag down and took a moment to look around. The lake stretched in all directions, an endless expanse of ice and faint snow. I could see the far tree line on the horizon, dark against the gray sky. The few fishermen I had passed earlier were tiny figures now, hunched and motionless. I began drilling a hole, the ice stubborn under my auger. Each turn of the handle required more effort than I expected, the cold metal biting at my hands despite gloves. I could feel the vibration through my arms, my breath coming in shallow bursts, the effort making me warm in a strange way beneath my layers. Finally, a circular hole opened up, jagged edges glinting in the dim light. I swept away the ice chips, and the water below looked impossibly dark. I had just begun setting my line when I heard it, a faint cracking, subtle at first, almost swallowed by the wind. I froze, listening carefully. The rest of the lake seemed calm, the ice solid and silent under the few fishermen out there. I told myself it was nothing. Ice shifts, that's all. But my gut tightened, a low, pulsing dread running through me. Then I saw movement in the hole I had just drilled. Not the quick, darting shimmer of a fish, but something slower, heavier, a jagged shadow that slithered beneath the surface. My eyes widened. The shadow traced along the edge of the hole, then stretched outward in irregular patterns. The ice around my spot had begun to fracture in a way that looked unnatural, like cracks branching quickly, almost deliberately. It wasn't just ice giving under pressure, it was breaking in sudden, sharp angles, and it looked capable of swallowing me if I stayed too close. Panic surged through me, sharp and immediate. I grabbed my gear, the rod, the tackle box, even my small bucket, and turned toward the other fishermen. My boots slid against the slick ice, snow flying in shallow sprays as I ran. Each step was precarious, every surface treacherously thin, the ice groaning and snapping faintly beneath me. The sound of breaking ice behind me made my stomach lurch. It wasn't just small cracks anymore. Louder snaps and deep groans followed me across the frozen surface. I didn't dare look back, only ran, desperate for the safety of the larger sheets of ice near the fishermen. Then came a sound that made me stop, frozen for a moment, a deep, loud crack, like a gunshot splitting the silence of the lake. The massive sheet of ice where I had set up began to shift, sliding slightly into the frigid water. Chunks of ice clattered and broke free, the surface around my hole buckling in a terrifying, sudden collapse. My heart was hammering, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my gear. The thought of falling in, of being trapped beneath the ice, made me want to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I forced myself forward, sliding and stumbling, finally reaching a thicker, more stable area where a few fishermen were seated, unbothered by what I had just experienced. Snowbanks surrounded their spots, providing some measure of stability, a visual separation from the raw, broken chaos I had just fled. I collapsed onto the nearest snowbank, gasping for breath, hands icy, face stinging from the wind. My knees were scraped from sliding across the rough ice, my coat wet from contact with slush and powder. I looked back toward my original spot, toward the fractured ice and the jagged pattern that had spread from it. The hole I had drilled was barely recognizable, swallowed by the shifting sheet, and the surrounding cracks looked like a frozen web ready to trap anything foolish enough to step onto it. The sound of the ice settling, cracking in slow, irregular pops, reminded me that the lake was alive in its own way, cold, indifferent, and dangerous. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, breathing hard, trying to calm my racing heart. Each inhale brought a sharp sting to my lungs. Each exhale formed clouds that dissolved into the gray air. The wind didn't let up, biting relentlessly, and I felt the first real signs of numbness creeping into my fingers and toes, despite the layers of insulation. My friend, who had stayed closer to the cluster, called out to check on me, but I barely heard him through the roar of the wind in my ears and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Eventually, I pulled myself together. I gathered what I had left, carefully, not daring to step near the edges of the ice where it might be weaker. My body was stiff from the cold and from adrenaline, but I forced myself to walk, not run, keeping weight distributed evenly and staying near the larger, thicker sheets that looked safe. The few other fishermen didn't pay much attention, wrapped in their own solitude and quiet work, but their presence was comforting. A small, tangible reassurance that I wasn't completely alone on the lake. By the time I reached the car, my entire body was aching, my boots soaked, and my gloves stiff and wet. I sat inside for a long time, letting the engine run, the heater blasting warmth that felt foreign and almost luxurious after the cold ordeal. My hands slowly thawed, and the fear that had clamped my chest loosened, though it didn't fully leave. I stared out at the frozen expanse, the lake silent again, deceptively calm. What had almost happened out there replayed in my mind. The sudden cracks, the shadows under the ice, the terrifying awareness of how quickly the ice could fail and how helpless I would have been if it had. It was a stark reminder that winter, especially in places like Minnesota, demanded respect, and that the thrill of solitude on a frozen lake came with real, unforgiving danger. I drove home slowly, the road slick, my body still tense and shaky, thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't reacted quickly, if I hadn't noticed the first subtle cracks. The day's excitement of fishing had turned into something much darker, a confrontation with the raw, indifferent power of nature. By the time I finally got home, I promised myself I would never underestimate winter again. The lake remained frozen in my memory, a vast, silent expanse that could turn deadly in an instant, a place where thrill and danger were inseparably linked, and where survival required respect, awareness, and a healthy fear of the cold. I rented a small, isolated cabin in the Colorado Rockies for a weekend, hoping to get away from everything people, noise, responsibilities. It was early December, the air already sharp with winter cold, and the roads leading up to the cabin were thin and winding, flanked by dense pine forests dusted in snow. The drive had taken longer than I expected, the last stretch barely wide enough for a single car. I parked next to the cabin and unloaded my bag, the snow already crunching under my boots, sending up tiny clouds with each step. The cabin looked empty and still, its wooden walls darkened by moisture and age. Smoke curled from the chimney, though I realized quickly it must have been from the previous occupant, because the fire was out. I set to work lighting it, the match sputtering in the dry air, and eventually got a small fire going, the flames licking at the logs and giving off a welcome warmth. The first night was quiet in a way that felt strange at first. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying flakes of snow that fell slowly, blanketing the world in white. I sat near the fire, reading a book, listening to the occasional crack of wood settling in the cabin. Outside, the snow accumulated in gentle waves along the roof and around the porch. There was a faint loneliness to the place, but it was comforting. A different kind of peace than I usually got in the city. I slept with the door locked, but the feeling of being entirely alone in the middle of the mountains didn't bother me. The second night was different. I had been asleep for only a few hours when I woke to a sudden howl of wind, rattling the cabin and shaking the windows. I could hear snow slapping against the sides of the building, heavy and unrelenting. I checked the weather on my phone, but service was non-existent, and the sky outside was already a solid wall of white, the snowstorm moving faster than any forecast had predicted. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just weather, just winter, but then I noticed the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was snow slipping off the roof or branches hitting the cabin. But the rhythm of the noise was deliberate, slow, almost deliberate, and it moved in a circle around the cabin. I moved cautiously from the bedroom to the living room, pulling the blinds down and checking the locks. Every door was secured, windows closed tightly. The footsteps continued, scraping against the porch, circling the cabin in a way that made my stomach twist. I couldn't see anything through the thick veil of snow, nothing but white swirling violently in the wind. I called the local ranger station, expecting at least a voicemail or a recorded warning, but there was nothing. No signal. No line. The snowstorm had swallowed the connection entirely. I sank into a chair near the fire, feeling the heat on my face, but unable to shake the chill creeping up my spine. Every creak of the cabin made my heart jump. Every bump, every thud outside, made me tense, gripping the heavy metal fire poker I had propped near the fireplace like a lifeline. Hours passed. I did not move from the corner, eyes glued to the window, listening. There was a sound I could not rationalize, something low and deliberate in the snow. Sometimes it was footsteps, sometimes it was dragging, the wood of the porch groaning under weight. At one point, I heard a voice whisper my name, faint and carried on the wind. I froze, straining to catch it again, but it didn't come. I told myself it was the storm, the snow shifting, my own mind playing tricks, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up anyway. I did not sleep, not for a single moment. I stayed awake, holding the poker in front of me, watching the window for movement, my ears straining for any hint of sound beyond the wind. By morning, the storm had subsided. The wind was gone, and the sun was dimly visible through a thinning gray sky. The snow outside was deep and pristine, except for the tracks that made me stiffen with unease. They were large, far larger than mine, and they circled the cabin in a rough pattern, scraping along the porch and disappearing into the woods at the back of the property. The tracks were deliberate, purposeful, but they ended abruptly, vanishing into the white blanket without return. I walked the perimeter slowly, crunching through the snow in my boots, examining every mark. Nothing was taken, nothing moved inside the cabin, and yet the feeling of intrusion lingered like a stain I could not wash away. Whoever or whatever had been there had made a point of being seen, of being heard, and then vanished as if it had never existed. I spent the day preparing to leave, shoveling my car free from the snowdrifts, the engine buried under at least 2 feet of packed snow. The work was exhausting, muscles aching in the thin winter air, but there was no rush. The experience had left me drained in a way I couldn't articulate, physically fine, but mentally tense, aware of how exposed I had been. I thought about how fragile security is in a place like that, how little separates safety from danger when there is no one around for miles. The isolation that had seemed peaceful now felt dangerous, a reminder that the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, and that the cold and snow can hide threats, whether they are human or otherwise. As I drove down the mountain later that day, the car heavy with snow and slush, I kept thinking about the footprints, the circling movement, the sound of my name whispered in the wind. I could not explain it. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a person staying nearby, and yet the presence had been undeniable. The memory stayed with me, the sensation of being watched, of having my solitude violated. It was the kind of fear that leaves no physical scar, but lingers in the mind, in the quiet moments of the day, in the rustle of a tree branch or the creak of a floorboard. I returned home safely, but I never rented another cabin in the middle of winter again. I don't go back to that part of the mountains, and I think about it whenever I drive through snow, covered roads alone, listening to the tires crunching through frozen gravel. It was a lesson in vulnerability, a reminder of how exposed you are when the world around you is silent, white, and empty. That night in the cabin, I understood that winter is beautiful, yes, but it can also be terrifying, and sometimes the scariest moments are the ones that leave no evidence behind, no way to prove they happened, only the memory and the unsettling awareness that you are never truly alone. I had just finished a late shift in Chicago, and the winter storm was worse than I had imagined when I left work. The snow had been coming down in heavy sheets for hours, turning the city streets into a blur of white. By the time I reached the highway, traffic had all but stopped. Cars were abandoned along the sides of the road, some half buried under snowdrifts, headlights flickering weakly or off entirely. The wind was relentless, cutting through my jacket and gloves, making my fingers sting and my face ache. Visibility was almost non-existent. I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The highway stretched out in a flat, unbroken white, and the thought of driving in that was almost unbearable. My car, which had been plodding along at 10 miles an hour, finally gave up, sliding to a halt in a patch of ice. The tires spun uselessly, kicking up snow, and I realized I was stuck. I tried calling roadside assistance, but the signal kept dropping. Every time I tried to make a call, the line would go dead, or the voice on the other end would cut out completely. I sat in the car for a long time, my hands shaking, not only from the cold but from the slow, creeping panic that began to set in. My phone was the only thing keeping me connected to the world, and without it, I felt completely isolated. After a few more attempts, I realized waiting in the car wasn't going to help. If help didn't come soon, I might be stranded there for hours, maybe all night. The thought made me shiver. I decided to walk. The nearest rest stop was supposedly a mile or so down the highway, but with the snow piling up around me and the wind pushing against me like a wall, it felt impossible. I pulled my hood tight around my face, tightened my scarf, and stepped out into the storm. The snow was deep, coming up to my knees in some spots. Each step was exhausting. My boots were wet, my socks soaked, and the cold seemed to settle into my bones. The highway signs were barely visible through the whiteness, and the rumble of distant traffic had vanished entirely. It was just me, the wind, and the endless snow. After only a few minutes, I started hearing something. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, crunching in the snow behind me. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. My mind started racing. Could it be another stranded driver? A mugger? Maybe someone lost like me? I dared not turn around. I didn't want to see a shadow or a figure emerging from the blizzard. My heart pounded in my chest as I kept moving, forcing my legs to keep going despite the snow sucking at my feet. The wind made it almost impossible to hear anything clearly. Every now and then, the crunching sound seemed to pause, and I would stop walking, listening. My chest tightened. The storm distorted sound so much that I couldn't tell if the noise was behind me or just the ice breaking under my own boots. The air was sharp and heavy in my lungs. I could feel my face burning from the cold, my eyes watering, snow clinging to my eyelashes, melting and freezing again. My fingers were numb despite my gloves, and my legs ached from the effort of pushing through the drifts. After what felt like hours of moving in slow, agonizing steps, I saw a faint glow ahead. Relief washed over me. It was hard to tell at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was the lights of a semi-truck, parked at an angle on the shoulder. The cab's lights flickered through the blowing snow, giving off a weak, warm glow in the otherwise gray, white world. I ran the last few steps, feeling hope rising in my chest. I reached the truck and pounded on the window, shouting, trying to get someone's attention. The cab was locked. I could see the figure of a man through the glass, sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out his face clearly because of the glare and reflection, but I felt his eyes on me. It was impossible to tell if he was asleep or awake, but something about the way he sat, motionless, staring straight ahead, made my stomach turn. I waved my arms, shouted, tried banging on the glass again. No response. My heart rate accelerated, panic building like a storm inside me. I ran around to the other side of the truck, hoping maybe he had gotten out, that I could find an open door, anything. The cab was empty. No one was there. The door was locked tight. No footprints in the snow around the truck except mine. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Did I imagine him? Was it a trick of the lights and shadows? My teeth chattered uncontrollably as I stepped back, realizing how exposed I was, how easy it would be for me to vanish in this storm with no one around to find me. I felt completely alone, and the crunching from earlier seemed louder now, echoing in my mind. I ran back toward the highway. The snow was deeper here, and the wind hit me from the side, knocking me slightly off balance. Every step was a fight, my boots heavy with snow. I kept moving, trying not to look back, imagining the worst possible scenarios with every step. The light from the truck faded behind me, swallowed by the storm. The crunching noises kept coming at intervals, never constant, never predictable. My imagination created shapes in the shadows, figures in the snow moving toward me, waiting to pull me under. Eventually, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief surged so sharply it almost hurt. I waved frantically, shouting, hoping they would see me through the storm. The car slowed and pulled over, the driver opening the window slightly, his face pale from the cold. I climbed in without saying a word, shivering uncontrollably. The heat inside the car was overwhelming after the cold, and I wrapped myself in the seatbelt, feeling the warmth seep back into my frozen body. The driver didn't ask questions. He drove slowly, carefully, keeping the wipers at full speed. I stared out the window, watching the storm continue its relentless assault on the highway. My mind replayed everything: the abandoned cars, the impossibly deep snow, the semi-truck, and the man, or maybe not a man, sitting still inside. I couldn't explain it, and the thought that maybe I had just been hallucinating from cold and exhaustion didn't make me feel any safer. By the time we reached a proper rest stop, the storm had not eased at all, but I felt some relief in knowing I was no longer alone, that help was finally nearby. I called my family to let them know I was okay, trying to steady my voice. I sat in the warm building, drinking coffee that burned my throat and made me tremble in a different way, and slowly the adrenaline faded. The storm outside still raged, but inside there was safety. I realized then how thin the line had been between me, making it home safely and disappearing into the snow forever. That night, even after returning home, the memory of that storm, the empty highway, and the silent figure in the truck stayed with me. Every time I drove past the same stretch of road, I felt the same chill in my stomach, a flash of panic that made my hands tighten on the wheel. But I never walked alone in a storm like that again, and I always made sure someone knew exactly where I was. It had been terrifying, exhausting, and completely real, a reminder of how quickly the world can feel like it disappears, leaving you entirely alone against the elements. Even months later, the memory lingered. I still remembered the way the wind felt like it could slice through flesh, how the snow could swallow every sound, and the impossible stillness of the truck and the figure inside. The image didn't fade, and it reminded me, more than anything, of how fragile safety can feel and how quickly it can vanish in the blink of an eye. I survived that night, but the fear, the panic, the overwhelming isolation, those stayed with me, etched into my memory, a constant caution whenever I looked at a winter sky or saw a storm rolling in. I woke up early that morning with the idea that a day on the cross-country trails in the Vermont State Park would be perfect. The snow had fallen fresh the night before, leaving everything bright and clean, and the air was crisp and cold, clear of any clouds. I wanted solitude, a chance to escape everything, to just move through the trees and snow under my own pace alone. I grabbed my ski poles and a small backpack with water, a snack, and a first aid kit. I made sure my layers were warm thermal shirt, fleece, insulated jacket, and gloves, and set off before the sun was fully up. The first stretch of trail was everything I had hoped for: the soft, even snow, the sound of my skis slicing through it, the occasional call of a bird. The forest was still, peaceful, and beautiful. I felt free. At first, I stayed on the main trail, but after a while, curiosity got the better of me. I saw a narrower track leading off to the side and decided to follow it. It wasn't marked, and I knew it could be risky, but I thought I could handle it. The snow was deeper here, and the trees were thicker, blocking some of the sunlight. The farther I went, the more the surroundings started to feel the same. Every tree looked like the one before it. Every curve in the trail seemed identical. I started noticing how quiet it had become. The sound of the skis on snow was the only thing breaking the silence, and even that seemed muffled by the heavy snow on the branches. After a couple of hours, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail markers were few and far between, and the sun was sinking, casting long shadows through the trees that made it hard to judge distances or directions. My phone, which I had relied on as a backup map, had died hours ago despite being fully charged when I left. Panic started creeping in, slow and steady. I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. The forest seemed endless, the snow unbroken except for the faint trail I had been following. I tried to think logically, remembering the layout of the park from the map I had looked at home, but it all blurred together. Every path looked the same, and my sense of direction failed me completely. I started walking, skis in hand now because it was getting harder to glide on the uneven snow. My steps sank into the powder, tiring me quickly. The wind had picked up slightly, chilling my exposed face and slipping under the layers of my clothing. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I just needed to find the main road or one of the larger trails. As I walked, I noticed tracks in the snow ahead. Someone else had been here recently. At first, I felt a rush of relief. Maybe someone would be able to help me, or maybe following them would lead me out. The tracks were clear boot prints, fresh in the snow, but they weren't on the main trail. They led off into the trees, curving in ways that didn't make sense, looping back toward where I had come from. I hesitated. The idea of following these tracks made me nervous, but staying where I was felt worse. I decided to follow them, hoping they would lead to safety. At first, it seemed promising. The prints were firm and deep, showing someone heavier than me had passed this way. But after walking for nearly half an hour, I realized I was going in a circle. Every tree, every bend in the snow, looked familiar. The tracks led me back almost exactly to the same spot I had started from an hour ago. I stopped and looked around, my chest tightening. The realization that I was completely lost began to sink in. The wind had picked up more, whistling through the branches and shaking the snow loose from the higher limbs. It fell in little showers, dusting the back of my neck and soaking my hair. My gloves had become stiff, and my fingers were numb despite me wiggling them inside their layers. I tried to stay calm, telling myself to pick a direction and stick with it. I chose a line that I thought would eventually lead back to the main trail, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of the road or a ranger station. But the light was fading fast. The sky had turned a muted gray, orange as the sun dipped below the trees. Shadows lengthened, making the forest feel like a maze of dark shapes. Every snap branch, every shift of snow, made my heart race. I kept imagining someone was watching me, but I knew it was just my mind playing tricks in the cold and quiet. Still, the tracks I had seen kept reappearing in my mind. Were they someone who had gotten lost too? Or worse, were they someone who might not want me around? The thought made me quicken my pace. After what felt like hours, I stumbled through thick brush and came across a small clearing. There, partially hidden by the snow and trees, was a ranger cabin. I hadn't known it existed. Relief washed over me, and I ran toward it, my boots sinking into the snow with every step. The cabin door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, sliding inside before I even thought about it. The warmth was minimal, but at least I was out of the wind. I collapsed against the wooden floor, shivering uncontrollably. My fingers were stiff and pale, and I could barely move them enough to unzip my jacket. I could feel the wetness from the snow soaking my clothes, making the cold even worse. I pulled off my gloves and hat, rubbing my hands together, trying to get circulation back. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. I could see a small stove in the corner, long since cold, and a bunk bed pushed against the wall. There were a few shelves with old supplies, canned food, matches, and a first aid kit, but nothing I could use immediately. I sank against the wall, exhausted and scared, thinking about the tracks, the twisting paths, and the sinking sun. I realized how easy it had been to get lost, how quickly the snow had erased the trails I had relied on, how close I had come to being stuck out there overnight. I stayed in the cabin for what felt like hours, letting my body warm slowly. I drank some water from my bottle and tried to calm my racing mind. Eventually, I felt steady enough to move. I decided to wait until morning. The snow had stopped falling, the wind had quieted, and there was no point in risking moving through the dark, disorienting forest. That night, I stayed awake as much as I could, listening to the wind in the trees outside and the occasional settling of snow on the roof. I thought constantly about the tracks and the endless forest, and a part of me stayed on edge, imagining shapes moving just beyond the window. I kept reminding myself it was just my imagination, but the fear lingered. When morning finally came, I felt a cautious optimism. The sun was rising, spreading soft light across the snow. I put on fresh layers, tightened my boots, and stepped outside. The forest looked different in daylight. Shapes became clearer. I retraced my steps carefully, this time paying close attention to landmarks and using the slope of the land to guide me. Eventually, after a long, tiring walk, I came across the main trail. Ski tracks were visible from other hikers who had passed the day before, and the path led directly toward the park entrance. My relief was immense. I followed the trail, skis clicking against the snow, until I finally saw the parking lot in the distance. The sun was higher now, warm enough to feel through my layers, and cars were scattered along the edge of the lot. I made it back safely, exhausted and drained, but alive. Looking back, I could still see the tracks in my mind. The ones that led me in circles. The ones that kept me on edge. The ones that reminded me how easily the forest could swallow someone. I didn't know who had left them, and part of me didn't want to. The forest hadn't been dangerous in the traditional sense. It hadn't attacked me or tried to trap me, but it had reminded me, in the cold and quiet, how small and vulnerable I really was, how easily a few wrong steps could turn a perfect day into a fight for survival. I packed up my gear, started my car, and drove home, never forgetting that day, never underestimating the snow and the forest again. The forest was still beautiful, still inviting, but I knew now to respect it fully, to always be prepared, and never to assume I could handle it alone. I had left late in the afternoon, hoping to reach my cousin's cabin before nightfall, but the weather had other plans. Northern Minnesota in December is beautiful, but it is unforgiving. The snow had been falling steadily all day, and by the time I reached the back roads, the main highways were already slick with ice and packed snow. The narrow paths I had chosen were barely plowed, if at all, and my little sedan struggled to maintain traction. Each curve brought a fresh jolt of fear as the tires slid, sometimes at an angle, making me overcorrect instinctively, only to slide the other way. The wind screamed through the treetops, whipping snow across the road in blinding sheets, and at times I had to slow to almost nothing just to see the edge of the path, which often disappeared entirely into the white nothingness of the forest. My hands were numb from gripping the wheel, and the heater did little more than create a faint warmth that barely reached my toes. I realized too late that I hadn't charged my phone. It had died somewhere in the middle of the storm, leaving me with no GPS, no ability to call for help, nothing but my own eyes and the dim headlights cutting through the snow. Panic crept in at intervals, though I tried to push it down. I told myself I was familiar with these roads, that I knew which trails led to my cousin's cabin. But familiar or not, the storm made every turn uncertain. Every shadow between trees seem alive. Every curve feel like the edge of a cliff. After what felt like an hour of crawling through snow and ice, I finally saw it, a small cabin, tucked deep into the forest, smoke rising lazily from its chimney. Relief hit me like a warm blanket. I could finally stop, take a breath, maybe even warm up before continuing to my cousin's place. The sight of the cabin felt like salvation, like someone had left a candle burning in the darkness just for me. My tires crunched over the snow as I parked near the front, the engine echoing strangely in the frozen stillness. The snow was already piling up around the car, powder sticking to the tires and wheel wells, and I noticed my footprints immediately becoming obscured as the wind scattered loose snow over them. I walked to the door and knocked. Hard, then again. No answer. The smoke continued to curl out of the chimney, a silent promise that someone somewhere was inside. My hand hesitated on the handle before I tried it, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door opened without resistance. A rush of cold air hit me as I stepped inside, carrying the sharp smell of snow and pine from outside. Then I noticed another scent, one that made my stomach twist. It was metallic coppery, mingling with the faint sweetness of burning wood like blood mixed with smoke. I froze, unsure whether to retreat immediately or investigate. The living room was small, with low ceilings and bare wooden walls, but there were dark streaks on the paneling that didn't belong to the normal pattern of wood grain. They were irregular, some jagged, some smeared. At first I thought it might be water damage from melting snow, but the pattern didn't match anything I had ever seen. I swallowed hard and stepped cautiously further inside. Every footstep creaked loudly on the old wooden floor, echoing in the tight space. I glanced around, seeing nothing. Just a small table, a couple of chairs, and a wood stove that was still faintly warm. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching across the corners of the room. I felt exposed, like someone could be watching from somewhere I couldn't see. I decided I needed to leave, that my cousin's cabin could wait. I had to get back to the car, back to the relative safety of metal and engine heat. I turned toward the door, planning to retreat, but then I noticed some footprints in the fresh snow outside. Heavy, deliberate, leading away from the cabin. They were human, I could tell, though impossibly large, and they didn't stop. They went into the woods, disappearing into the blur of white and shadows. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever had left those prints hadn't gone anywhere, or maybe they had circled back inside. My pulse spiked. Then I heard its soft footsteps upstairs, slow but unmistakable, each step pressing down on old wooden boards that groaned under the weight. My mind raced. There should be no one here, yet the sound was real and too close to ignore. I didn't pause. I ran. My boots slipped in the powder as I scrambled back to the car, throwing myself inside and slamming the door. The metal shell of the vehicle felt like a temporary fortress, and I fumbled with the keys until the engine roared to life. My hands shook violently as I shifted into drive, the tires spinning in the soft snow before catching enough traction to move. I didn't look back. Not once. The headlights cut through the swirling white, illuminating the occasional tree, but nothing else. No shadow moved in the periphery, though I half expected something to appear. The storm seemed to intensify as I drove, the wind now slamming into the car like a physical force, rocking it from side to side. Visibility was near zero, the road ahead nothing but white, broken only by the faint outline of pine trees. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud in my ears, and I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The thought that someone, or something, had been inside that cabin lingered. I imagined footprints following me, imagined shapes moving behind the windshield wipers, fleeting slashes of visibility. But no matter how fast the imagination raced, the reality was simple. I needed to survive the storm. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. I recognized the road leading to my cousin's cabin, the one I had been aiming for before the storm swallowed the back roads entirely. Relief flooded me, though exhaustion followed immediately. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching over packed snow, and parked. The small cabin stood in welcome, lights warm against the winter night. I was finally safe. I stepped out into the cold, letting the car door slam behind me, and breathed in deeply. The smell of pine smoke and the faint hint of burning logs filled the air. I went inside my cousin's cabin and locked the door behind me, checking the windows and securing the place. The warmth of the fire slowly seeped into my frozen body. My pulse, though still elevated, began to calm. I realized how close I had come to something I couldn't name, something I wasn't prepared to face alone. I made a mental note to never drive those back roads in a storm again, no matter how familiar I thought I was. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white silence, but inside I was safe. I had made it through, shaken but alive, and that alone was enough to bring a measure of peace. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat by the fire, and let the heat drive away the fear, knowing I had survived the night and that the storm outside could not touch me anymore. I thought it would be a good idea to spend a quiet day ice fishing alone on a lake in northern Wisconsin. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that made your lungs feel like they were freezing with every breath. I had been looking forward to the solitude, the stillness, the way the world seemed to pause under a thick layer of ice and snow. I parked my truck at the edge of the forest, grabbed my gear, and trudged across the snow-covered ground toward the lake. The snow crunched beneath my boots with each step, and I felt a strange calm wash over me as the trees thinned and I reached the wide open expanse of the frozen water. At first, everything was peaceful. The lake stretched out in front of me, a flat, pale gray expanse dotted with small snowdrifts. Thin mist rose off the ice, curling and twisting in the weak light of the overcast sky. The occasional bird called somewhere in the distance, and every so often, I heard a sharp, cracking sound from the ice far away, a reminder of the hidden dangers below. I drilled a hole and set my fishing line. Sitting down on the small foldable chair I had brought, I watched the tip of my rod, feeling the cold seep through my gloves into my fingers. The quiet was deep, the kind of quiet that made you hyper, aware of every tiny sound. The scraping of my boots on ice, The whisper of wind across the surface, the faint, distant groan of the lake as it shifted slightly under its own weight. Hours passed slowly. The wind picked up, but it was steady, almost soothing. I thought about how lucky I was to have this time alone, how few people ever came this far out. Occasionally, the ice would crack somewhere in the distance with a sound like a rifle shot, making me glance around nervously. But it was always far away, harmless. I caught a couple of small fish, the kind that made good bait but weren't worth much. I put them in my small cooler and watched the mist thicken as the day wore on. Then, without warning, the ice beneath me shifted. It wasn't a small crack or a familiar creak. It was a deep, echoing crack that started at my fishing hole and ran outward in long, jagged lines across the lake. The sound was terrifying, like the ice was splitting apart under some unimaginable weight. My stomach dropped. I froze completely, unsure what to do. The ice beneath me wobbled as if it were alive, and I could feel it bending with every small movement I made. My heart raced, hammering in my chest, and I realized I wasn't prepared for what was happening. I tried to move slowly toward the shore, keeping my weight low and trying not to disturb the ice, but the snow around my legs gave way suddenly with a loud snap. I fell forward onto the ice, my hands scraping against the sharp edges. Cold water seeped into my gloves and soaked the sleeves of my jacket. I scrambled, crawling inch by inch, using my hands and knees to pull myself along. Every step made the ice groan and crack beneath me, sending splinters of fear shooting through my chest. I kept my head down, eyes fixed on the nearest patch of solid-looking ice, knowing that one wrong move could send me plunging into the freezing water. The crawl felt endless. My fingers and knees were raw and bleeding from the rough ice. The wind blew harder, biting at my exposed skin, and the mist had thickened into something almost like smoke over the lake. Shadows seemed to move in the gray light, and every sound, the snapping of ice, the distant rush of water beneath thin sheets of frozen surface, made me flinch. My lungs burned from the cold and from panic. I couldn't even tell how far I had come, or how far I had left. Finally, after what felt like hours but could have been only minutes, I reached a patch of ice that seemed more stable. I forced myself to get onto my hands and knees fully and pushed toward the shore. My jacket and pants were wet and frozen in some places, sticking to my skin. My hair was damp and frozen along the edges of my hood. Every muscle ached from the crawling, and I was shaking uncontrollably, but I couldn't stop moving. I had no choice. When I finally made it to the shoreline, I collapsed under a large pine tree, my body shivering so hard it was difficult to breathe. I tried to gather myself to think clearly, but the snowdrifts around me had erased all of my tracks. The shoreline looked completely different. There was no sign of my truck, no trail back through the woods. I was completely disoriented. I had no phone. I had left it charging at home, thinking I wouldn't need it. I felt completely exposed, small and fragile in the middle of this vast, silent wilderness. I stayed crouched under that pine for hours, listening to the ice groaning and snapping behind me. It was like the lake was alive, a massive, shifting creature just waiting for another moment to grab me. Night fell slowly, the pale gray of day giving way to the dark blue of early evening, and the wind seemed to carry my panic back to me, echoing across the empty lake. I huddled closer to the tree, using my jacket to try to hold in what little warmth I had left. Every time the ice cracked, my heart leapt. I had no food, no way to start a fire, nothing but the snow and my soaked, frozen clothes. I considered trying to walk back into the woods, but every direction looked unfamiliar, every tree and snowdrift a potential trap. Morning finally came, pale and gray. The wind had died down, but the cold remained sharp and merciless. I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay under the pine forever. I forced myself to stand, testing my legs, still weak from exhaustion and cold. I remembered the edge of the forest near where I had parked. Using the position of the sun and the vague outline of trees that I hoped matched what I remembered, I started walking. Every step was slow and careful, the snow sometimes knee-deep, sometimes hiding jagged ice beneath. I had to rest frequently, crouched or leaning against a tree, my hands burning and numb at the same time. I checked every tree and snowdrift, looking for signs I might be going the right way, but most of the landscape looked the same, white, flat, endless. Hours passed, and I finally spotted a familiar ridge of trees, something I recognized from the path to the truck. My heart lifted with relief, though exhaustion made it slow to show on my face. I followed the ridge, carefully picking my way over snowdrifts and hidden ice. Eventually, I could see my truck parked in the small clearing near the forest edge, looking ordinary and untouched, as if nothing had happened. I collapsed onto the doorframe, shivering uncontrollably but safe. I started the engine, the warm air from the heater filling the cab and thawing my frozen fingers. I didn't drive straight home. I stayed in the truck for a long time, letting my body warm and trying to calm the relentless panic still thrumming through me. By the time I finally drove home, my clothes still damp and stiff from freezing water, I was exhausted in a way I had never experienced. I knew I had survived something serious, something that could have killed me in minutes if I had been careless. The memory of the ice cracking, the cold water, the dark night under the pine would stay with me forever. But I also felt a strange, quiet pride. I had faced the worst of the lake and come out alive, relying only on my instincts, patience, and the stubbornness not to give up. From that day on, I respected the ice differently, never venturing out alone without careful preparation, always aware that the lake could turn from peaceful to deadly in an instant. I had learned that the wilderness does not forgive mistakes, and I had been lucky to walk away. I was driving through Colorado on one of the worst snowstorms I've ever experienced, trying to get home for the holidays. The highway was barely visible under a thick layer of snow and ice, and the wind was howling like it wanted to tear the car from the road. My headlights barely cut through the whiteout, and every few seconds, the tires slipped slightly, sliding across the ice. I had been driving for hours, inching forward at maybe 20 miles per hour, when I saw the truck. It had jackknifed across the highway, its cab angled toward the ditch, and the trailer stretched across both lanes, completely blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop a safe distance away. My heart was hammering, and my fingers were numb despite the thick gloves. There was no one in sight. I honked once, then again, but the snow swallowed the sound immediately. I realized that I had no way to get past it, and with the storm getting worse, I couldn't turn back either. I decided to pull over to the shoulder, digging the wheels slightly into the snow to avoid sliding back onto the road. I sat there for a long time, hoping someone else would come along, some truck or car that could get me out or at least warn me if there was help nearby. But nothing came. The hours stretched endlessly. The wind was relentless, slamming the car with gusts that made the metal body vibrate. Snow piled up quickly around my tires, covering the tracks I had made, making it impossible to tell which way I could go if I tried to move. Inside, I tried to stay calm. I had a small stash of water and granola bars, enough for maybe a day, but I knew that if night fell and the temperature kept dropping, I wouldn't last long exposed like this. I wrapped myself in the blankets I kept in the trunk and tried to stay warm, but the cold still seeped into the car. The engine was off to save fuel, and even with the heater running, the air inside the car became bitterly cold. As darkness fell, I could barely see the snow around me. The storm had intensified, turning the world outside into a thick white blur. That's when I saw it movement, faint and slow in the distance, trudging through the deep snow. At first, I thought it was another stranded driver coming to help, someone just as desperate as me. Relief washed over me briefly. I unlocked the doors, ready to call out, but something felt off. The figure wasn't moving like a normal person. They stumbled, hunched over, dragging something heavy behind them through the snow. I couldn't see clearly, but the dragging motion sent a wave of panic through me. I locked the doors again and rolled the windows up, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. My chest felt tight, and my mind raced with every possible explanation. Maybe it was someone injured, trying to get to the highway, but the way they moved, jerky, uneven, almost mechanical, made my stomach twist. I kept the lights low, hoping they wouldn't notice me immediately. The footsteps drew closer. I could hear the snow crunching, faint at first, then louder, circling the car. The sound of something heavy scraping against the ice, and snow added to the tension. It stopped at the driver's side, then the passenger side, then the back of the car. Each pause felt like hours. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an animal, but nothing in my experience moved like this. There was a weight to each step, deliberate, slow, and impossible to ignore. I stayed awake all night, too scared to sleep. I sipped water occasionally, ate a small granola bar, and kept checking the windows, but the figure never came directly to the car. It walked around it, stayed just out of reach, and disappeared behind drifts only to return moments later. I counted the hours, listening to the storm, listening to the snow settle, listening to the footsteps that never touched the metal, never knocked, never made a sound that would announce their presence clearly. My mind played tricks on me. I thought I saw shadows inside the car, felt breaths on my neck, but every time I looked it was empty. Eventually the storm slowed, the wind dropped slightly, and the snow began falling in softer flakes instead of the violent gusts that had been battering me. I kept waiting tense, every sense alert. Dawn came slowly, pale and gray. The world outside turned from blinding white to a muted, frosted gray. I hesitated to look out the window at first, afraid the figure might still be there, but I needed to see if I could get moving. When I finally looked, everything was still. The figure was gone. I scanned the area. No truck, no footprints, nothing to indicate someone had been there at all. The snow was untouched, a fresh layer covering every track. I could hardly believe it. My body relaxed slightly, but the lingering dread didn't fully go away. I started the car, tested the tires, and gingerly eased onto the road. The ice was still treacherous, and the snow had drifted into small mounds that could throw me off at any second, but the highway stretched ahead, empty and silent. The strange figure was nowhere to be seen, and though I was shaken, I forced myself to drive slowly, steadily. I focused on keeping the car straight, avoiding the patches of black ice that glimmered faintly in the early light. Hours passed before I saw another car. A snowplow was clearing the lanes, its orange lights flashing. Relief hit me in waves. I followed it at a safe distance, feeling the snow and ice gradually become less threatening as the morning wore on. The highway started to clear, and by mid-morning, I could see familiar signs indicating towns and gas stations. I stopped at the first open place I found, warming my hands on a cup of coffee and telling myself I had made it. I was shaken, exhausted, and cold, but I was alive. When I finally got home, safe and warm, I sat by the window, looking at the road that had been so treacherous only hours before. The memory of the figure circling the car haunted me, but I tried to reason it out. Maybe it had been another driver, lost and dragging a fallen load, or someone injured who had gone on before I could see clearly. Whatever it was, it stayed in the shadows, leaving no trace. I didn't see anyone else on the road that night. No signs of a truck, no tracks in the snow, nothing but the storm and my own fears. I told myself that the world sometimes puts you in strange, unexplainable situations. That night was one of them. The important part was I survived, and I learned to never underestimate the danger of a snowstorm, the isolation of a highway in winter, and the strange, quiet terror that comes from seeing someone or something move in a way that doesn't belong. By the next day, the roads were clearer, the storm had passed, and I was finally able to move forward, carrying the memory of that night as a warning and a reminder of how fragile safety can feel when the world turns white and silent around you. Even now, years later, when I drive through snowstorms, I think back to that night. I think of the way the wind howled, the way the snow piled up, the way the footsteps circled my car, and the figure that was never there in the light. It reminds me that survival is often about patience, vigilance, and the ability to stay calm when nothing makes sense, because sometimes reality itself is enough to scare you without anything supernatural at all. Last winter, I decided to go hiking alone in the Cascades. It was supposed to be a simple, short loop, something I could do in a few hours, and the weather report said light snow. I figured I had done enough winter hiking to handle it. I packed my usual gear, a small backpack with water, snacks, a map, a compass, a flashlight, and a thin emergency blanket, and drove up early in the morning. The air in the parking lot was cold and sharp, and the sky was gray, low and heavy, but I told myself it would pass. The first steps on the trail were easy enough. Snow crunched under my boots, and my breath made small clouds in the frigid air. Everything seemed quiet, serene even, with only the occasional call of a bird or the whisper of the wind through the pines. At first, it was peaceful. I passed familiar landmarks and felt confident I could complete the loop in a few hours. But the further I went, the faster the weather worsened. The light snow from the morning thickened into steady flakes that clung to my jacket and buried the trail under a clean, white blanket. Soon, any recognizable markers were gone. The path I had known so well was now a uniform sea of white. Every tree looked the same, every slope and hollow blended together. I tried to follow footprints, but even those vanished quickly under fresh snow. My phone had died an hour earlier, so I had no GPS, no way to call for help, no way to check where I was. The realization hit me suddenly. I had no idea where I was, and the sun was already dipping lower in the sky. Panic began to set in. My fingers were numb despite gloves, and my legs felt like lead. Every step required effort, and each breath seemed shallow more from fear than exertion. The wind picked up, slicing across my face and making it hard to hear anything. I thought I heard voices at first, soft, distant shouts, but I was alone. There was no one else for miles. The snow muffled most sounds, and the wind seemed to carry faint echoes of my own imagination. I stumbled on a patch of ice hidden under the snow and fell hard, scraping my knee and twisting my shoulder. My backpack tore open in the fall, scattering my map, compass, and a few snacks into the snow. I scrambled to gather them, but the cold was making my movements clumsy, my fingers refusing to obey me fully. I thought about making a fire. I tried to gather dry sticks and small branches, but the snow had soaked everything. I struck a match again and again, but the flame flickered and died each time, leaving me staring into the gray, featureless forest, feeling smaller with each passing minute. Hours passed, or maybe only one, I could not tell. My body was cold to the bone, my muscles stiff and trembling. I finally gave up and huddled under a large pine tree, trying to conserve what warmth I had left. I curled up as tightly as I could, wrapping my arms around my legs, and pulled the emergency blanket over me, though it did little against the damp and the wind. I shivered violently, unable to stop, my teeth chattering, my heart racing. I do not remember falling asleep. When I finally woke, the snow had stopped. The world was still blanketed in white, but the wind had died down. My body ached. My clothes were wet through, and the cold had left deep bruises on my knees and arms from slipping and falling earlier. I knew I had to move, had to find any path out. I started walking slowly, deliberately, trying to follow any sign that might indicate a trail. Broken branches, depressions in the snow, anything that looked unnatural I took as a clue. Step by step I descended a slope, careful not to slip again. My feet were frozen, my legs unsteady, but I forced myself forward. The descent was treacherous. Snow hid rocks and roots, and every step was a gamble. At one point, I slid down a small hill and landed on my side, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there for a moment, listening to the hollow silence of the forest, my body aching, wondering if I could go on. Slowly I got up, each movement agonizing, and pressed on. Eventually, I saw a faint line in the snow ahead, broken and irregular, but straight enough to suggest a man-made path. My heart lifted with a fragile hope. I followed it, moving cautiously until the shapes of trees thinned and the outlines of a wide, flat road began to appear. It was a logging road, scarred by tire tracks and cleared of most of the heavier snow. Relief washed over me, and I could feel my pace quicken despite the stiffness in my legs. I followed the road for what felt like hours, though it was probably less. My body was exhausted, my hands and feet nearly numb from cold, and the wetness of my clothes weighed me down. Every sense was sharpened, every sound amplified: the crack of a branch under a tree, the crunch of my own boots in the snow, the distant rush of water somewhere below the road. I kept moving, because stopping meant giving in, and giving in meant risking hypothermia. Eventually, I reached a cleared area where I could see signs of human activity: fresh tire tracks, a small shed, and a pickup truck parked nearby. My relief turned to determination as I staggered toward it, waving my arms until finally someone appeared. I had made it. They gave me blankets, hot water, and a warm place to sit, and I slowly felt life return to my frozen body. I realized how close I had come to serious injury, perhaps worse, and it hit me like a wave: I would never hike alone in winter again. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a labyrinth of ice, snow, and disorientation. The hours of wandering, the panic, the cold, they would stay with me forever, etched into memory. From that day forward, I resolved never to underestimate the mountains, never to ignore weather warnings, and never to trust my own confidence over preparation. The experience left me cautious but also grateful. Grateful for warmth, for safety, for the simple fact of being alive. I remembered the sound of my own breath, the way snow muffled everything, the bruises and cuts that marked my body, and I understood just how unforgiving winter can be in the Cascades. Every time I think back to that day, I see the gray sky, the endless white, and the thin line of the logging road that saved me. It was a lesson I learned the hard way, and I carry it with me every time I step into the woods in winter, never alone, never unprepared, and always aware of how easily a simple hike can become a fight for survival.